Here's what's coming up on episode 42 of the Big Séance podcast. Part 1 of my conversation with Keith Johnson, now a well-known demonologist, who was one of the original investigators on the scene of the real-life The Conjuring case.
As soon as I set foot on the property, there was something wrong there. You just felt something was wrong.
It was the split second I said that, try calling upon the name of Jesus, that slammed down with tremendous force. And one of the girls, her head flew to the side. She'd been slapped on the left side of her head.
I had suggested maybe we should consult with the Warrens. These people are really, really in danger, seemingly in danger from at least one hostile spirit.
The head was hanging to one side as if the neck had been broken. And the figure started saying, "I'll drive you mad with fiery brooms. I'll drive you mad with death and gloom. I'll drive you out, but 'twill be too late. You'll be dead." Lorraine came in, said there is a spirit here. It's Bathsheba. This family's in danger. And they had a private conference with Roger and Carolyn. And that's when they said that PIRO has to leave. So
I'm curious, when the production company is putting together the story for this movie, do you think they knew that a lot of this stuff was a little inaccurate or there were myths involved? Or do you think no one bothered to really correct it and research it?
And of course, the movie sealed Bathsheba's reputation pretty much for all time.
The movie, she claims, is complete fiction and not based on reality. Andrea Perron was more involved in the movie than she claims. That's what she says. She says Carolyn Perron made up much of the haunted history of the home, including details of the infamous Bathsheba.
Norma and her husband, their lives were turned upside down by the release of this movie through no fault of their own. It's just that they were, unfortunately, victims of circumstance.
Welcome to the Big Séance podcast. I'm Patrick Keller of BigSeance.com, and this is a place for an open discussion on all things paranormal, but specifically topics like ghosts and hauntings, paranormal research, spirit communication, psychics and mediums, and life after death. So basically, anything that pops up in my paranormal world. The candles are already lit, so you might as well come on in and join the Séance.
Welcome back, Paranerds. Patrick Keller here. I've probably said this before, but today I really do think I have one of the most interesting episodes that I've ever shared with you. It's so interesting that it's going to take quite a bit of introduction because there's some context you will need, as well as some behind-the-scenes information. So please bear with me. As many of you probably remember, back in July of 2013, I was able to catch an early screening of what ended up being a hugely popular box office hit, The Conjuring. This led to me researching the real story behind the movie and reading Andrea Perron's trilogy, House of Darkness, House of Light. Andrea is the eldest daughter of the family that experienced the very real hauntings that inspired that movie. Not long after the movie, the farmhouse where the real story took place was being trampled and trespassed on by fans of the movie, turning the lives of the current owners of the home upside down. Andrea put out a heartfelt request for people to give them privacy and to stop trespassing. A year later, the current owner, Norma, contacted me through BigSeance.com with her side of the story and a kind of video rebuttal of what she felt was a false story of hauntings that the production company of The Conjuring and Andrea's books presented. And clearly, she was upset by the fact that the privacy of her and her husband was being violated after the success of the movie. I did blog about Norma's comments and video, though I must confess, the story was getting too complicated for me. I loved The Conjuring. I had fallen in love with Andrea's books, which are quite a bit different, and they're supposed to be the true accounts of this story. and I wasn't sure what to do with the information that Norma was now giving me. More time passed, and I was contacted by a man named Keith Johnson. Keith is a paranormal researcher and demonologist. He's been featured on several paranormal television programs, including early episodes of Ghost Hunters and Ghost Adventures. But he let me know that he was one of the first researchers on the scene of the Perron's farmhouse in the 1970s, before Ed and Lorraine Warren were even involved. Keith is even mentioned in Andrea's third book. The connection with the Warrens takes an interesting turn, however, and you'll hear about that in this episode. So about 6 months ago, Keith and I were preparing to record our interview. We were inundated with endless technology problems and hiccups that made our scheduled interview happen way later than we had intended. But we finally got started. Then our connection continued to be dropped. I couldn't help but notice that every time this happened, it was the climax of some story or event that he was describing from the farmhouse. Keith later told me that he had experienced these problems before during interviews, and he honestly felt that something supernatural may be preventing parts of the story from getting out. I had Keith retell some of those stories, only to have the same thing happen again. We ended up making 3 attempts, the last time even being over the phone, which is usually reserved as the last option when recording a podcast interview. Interestingly, and sadly, we had the same problems over the phone. I was frustrated because this was such an awesome story directly from Keith, and I felt I was missing too many pieces from the recording, making it nearly impossible to present this cool story in an episode. We were not able to connect again until just recently. I crossed my fingers that this time things would go smoothly. It did. So Keith was able to have a second chance to tell most of his story, and I got a lot more information from him in general this time. So in today's longer episode, you're going to hear a highly edited version of Keith's story from 2 separate dates. 6 months ago, I had a completely different microphone and sound system, and I was in a completely different studio. Things have improved in that department since then. You'll also notice by the sound of my voice that 6 months ago, I was a little under the weather. Ironically, I'm a little under the weather today as I record this in September of 2015, but hopefully it sounds okay. The audio will be presented in a way that makes sense, but these clips weren't necessarily recorded chronologically, and the difference between some of the audio will be obvious. You'll hear Keith describing what led him to the farmhouse as a young man in the 70s, and his first meeting with the Perron family, the tour of the residence, and some of the experiences that he had with his team, PIRO. Along the way, I'll break in with important stories from all of the characters and investigators involved. We'll discuss the truth and legend of the infamous Bathsheba. We'll talk about Andrea's books. We'll get the controversial details of Ed and Lorraine Warren's involvement, and Keith's thoughts on the movie, The Conjuring. You're going to want to hear this one, so stay right there. Here we go.
Welcome to the Big Séance podcast, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you for having me, Patrick. It's a privilege and an honor to be here.
I'm very honored to talk to you as well. So I've got some kind of bullet points here that I put together about your bio, and then how about I just let you fill in the gaps if I missed anything? That sound good?
That sounds great.
All right. So Keith, along with his wife Sandra, are the founders of New England Anomalies Research and Investigations. They're demonologists as well as paranormal investigators. They're hosts of Ghosts Are Near, which I've watched on YouTube, but I think can also be viewed in other ways. We'll let him tell us about that. He's got a series of books called Paranormal Realities, which we can maybe talk about later. Keith, you had the opportunity to investigate with Taps in some of the very first Ghost Hunters episodes, a show that has been around for a decade now and has really changed the face of the paranormal and paved the way for similar shows. That must have been really, I didn't mean to jump into a question already, but that must have been really exciting at that time.
It was quite an experience. And working with the Atlantic Paranormal Society, of course, there were adventures before the TV show, prior to that, and but it did lead up to it being a national TV show. And that was certainly an exciting experience. It really was.
I bet it was. So what exactly brought you to the Perron's farmhouse back in the 70s? And what were those experiences? What did you find?
Well, remember, there was no internet at the time we're talking about. We're talking about the early 1970s. And I put an ad in the local newspaper. It was a local circulation for several counties. And it was an ad. At the time, I belonged to a group that was based at Rhode Island College called Parapsychological Investigation and Research Organization. And that's a pretty long name, so we simply called ourselves PIRO. And we weren't pyromaniacs. We were actually investigating unexplained happenings. And I did put an ad in the paper saying we investigate free of charge things that are unexplained. And I thought it would either be ignored or laughed at, but I took a chance, and we were contacted a few weeks later on behalf of the Perron family, and that's how we came to be involved with the Perron situation in Harrisville, Rhode Island. And, of course, a very beautiful rural spot in Rhode Island, northern Rhode Island. And we arranged to come to the farmhouse and meet the family and investigate to see what we thought. Now, the family was reportedly going through quite a crisis. They had moved in about 3 years before, and not quite 3 years. And it was an 18th century farmhouse, actually constructed in 1736. And there had been some modifications and renovations over the years, but very, very lovely place. There was a nice little pond and a bridge joining the property, a very, very nice, picturesque New England farmhouse. But I had been working all day at my landscaping job. You know, being a teenager, I was 18 years old at the time. And after a hard day's work, fortunately, I was young enough to actually work all day and then do something at night back then. And we came to the farmhouse, myself and other PIRO members, and we came there. As soon as I set foot on the property, there was something wrong there. You just felt something was wrong. It's hard to describe unless you've actually felt it, but it's just the feeling that something is really wrong. You feel like anxiety, like something doesn't want you there. It's an overwhelming feeling. It's like being in a probably living next to a power station. If you've ever had that experience, and it does get you after a while. But this was as soon as you walked down the property, something was wrong. As beautiful as the place was, nice family. Beautiful family. It was a couple, Roger and Carolyn Perron, and their 5 daughters of various ages. The eldest being Andrea Perron, who was about 15 years old at the time. And they decided they were going to give us a tour of the house and the barn out and back.
We'll get back to the tour that the Perron children were giving Keith. But since we're at the barn, here's some information that Keith later gave me about this space. In this clip, you'll hear one of these dropped moments as Keith was describing the energy in the barn.
Now, there was a rumor, nothing historically proven, but there was a rumor that a woman had hanged herself in the barn over 100 years before. Now, as soon as you went in that barn, like you were just drained of energy, and you felt a little nauseous. Something was very, very wrong in that barn. Something not tangible, but the atmosphere was very, very depressing. You just didn't want to stay in there for very, very long. Of course, there were the rumors about a woman hanging herself in the 1800s, but it was just not a pleasant atmosphere to be in there.
There was a suicide, and there was, you see, a lot of the things were in the, there were some things in the town record, but most of it was in the town rumors. And these rumors that have been around for, like at least a couple of generations, and long before the Perron family came to the Burrillville, Harrisville section of Burrillville. A lot of this was hearsay and what people had said throughout the years, and facts had been jumbled up. And of course, the original story was that Bathsheba Sherman had hanged herself in the Perron's barn out and back. But what really happened, the true history, it was actually there was a hanging, there was a suicide, but it was a Mrs. John Arnold, Susan Arnold, and that was in 1866. And it was on the neighboring road. It was actually on Collins Taft Road, which is nearby to Round Top Road. But it wasn't Bathsheba Sherman at all. It was actually Susan Arnold, who was age 50. And we're not sure because, we don't know very much about her motivation or anything. We just know that she was apparently very suicidal, because it wasn't just a split decision, split second decision. She had a bunch of weapons that she was going to apparently use on herself, all methods of suicide. She was either going to poison herself or shoot herself, and she wound up hanging herself by a cord, and her hanging was very, it's terrible as it is. It was in some ways very similar to the late Robin Williams.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Yeah, she didn't really take a rope and a noose. What she did was tie a cord around her, a thin cord around her neck, and hung herself in a door frame. So similar to the way Robin Williams did.
So the Perron children took a liking to Keith, and they left the barn and continued on their tour.
The younger daughters grabbed me by the wrist. We're going to take Keith on a walk all around the yard and all through the property. And they showed me the little bridge there and how nice the place was. And it was a very nice tour. But when we got back to the house, then you felt that uncomfortable feeling again. Now, the mother of the household explained to us that some bizarre things had really begun to happen there ever since they moved in. First, the children started seeing these strange apparitions, especially the young man that walked around the staircase and would look at them. And not knowing his name, they referred to him as Manny, because he was a young man. He was dressed in probably Victorian-style clothing. But a number of these apparitions that they would see from time to time flitting about the household, the mother did not see them at the time, and her husband Roger didn't see them at all. And just one thing after another started getting very, very bizarre, feeling that she was being watched and that something was kind of targeting her. She felt like she was being picked on.
The family weren't the only ones seeing apparitions. Keith's twin brother, Carl, who was also a member of the research team, saw an apparition himself.
Yes, he'd gone upstairs to use the bathroom, and this was around twilight. It was in August. It was a very, very humid summer evening, and he saw some kind of a dark, misty figure just floating, and it seemed to be coming towards him. And before it reached him, it dissipated. So, I mean, when he saw that, he really before then, he'd been downstairs talking with Carolyn. Now, I was outside with the children at the time. This is while they were giving me a tour of the house. So my brother was downstairs with Donna, who was the chairperson of PIRO, and Andrea, I believe, was in the next room. And the father was out for the evening, and they heard some heavy walking or treading upstairs. Some rumbling was going on. And my brother asked, "Who's upstairs, by the way?" And Carolyn said, "Oh, that just goes on all the time anyway. No one's upstairs. We're always hearing that." But it was some time later, and it was around twilight, where my brother did go upstairs to use the bathroom, and that's when he saw this misty figure in the hallway, and it did seem to be floating towards him, and then it dissipated. So he then had no doubt that there was some paranormal manifestation going on in this house. It's, personally, I believed Carolyn. I thought she was very, very sincere. But after being there that night, that left no doubt in our minds at all that these people were sincere, at least about that they were experiencing something there, and that there was paranormal activity in their home. And we were not the first people they contacted. Obviously, the first people they talked to about this was the church. In fact, the rumors about the Perron family living in the spooky house were happening. And of course, especially Andrea would sometimes talk to her peers and talk to other people at church. This is what is going on here. And the church basically turned their back on him. And in fact, they kind of encouraged them, maybe you want to go someplace else, because this is very upsetting to the other parishioners. So they didn't get any help from the church, obviously.
So back to Keith's tour with the children. They took him back into the house and upstairs to one of the bedrooms, where Keith would have his first paranormal experience in the house, and was able to be of comfort to the girls.
Of course, the children had given me a walk through the property and showed me the little bridge they had and the stream there and what a beautiful place it was. And you kind of forget about how dismal the house felt. It wasn't until we went back into the house that I started feeling that again. And they took me upstairs, gave me a tour of the upstairs, and that's when I started feeling that really almost like nausea, almost like an electric current going on, and it seemed to be kind of building in intensity. And they took me into one of their bedrooms and told me just how frightened they were. I mean, when they were outside, it was very much gaiety. They were very happy to have me there. They were pulling me by my wrist. Each one of the girls was pulling on to me. But when we're back in the house, then it became, they started telling me how frightened they were to go to sleep at night. And I could just feel the intensity building in that room. And it's difficult to describe because everything happened so fast. Mm-hmm. But they were telling me how afraid they were. And they were afraid to go to bed at night. And they didn't like to sleep by themselves. So I asked them, what's your religion? What do you believe? Now, of course, in the movie The Conjuring, they supposedly have no beliefs at all. But in reality, they did attend this local school in the Catholic Church. But they told me, we're Christians, we're Catholic. We pray and everything. So I told them, well, when you feel afraid, try calling upon the name of Jesus. Now, as soon as I said that, it was like somebody flipped on some kind of current. You could feel, it was like a vibration. I could feel it in my stomach. I could feel that current going. And so it was pulsating. And definitely some kind of electric current. That's what it felt like. It was draining. Also, within splits, there was a window. Some of the windows could not be closed, especially there was a window in their bedroom that could not be closed because of the humidity. It was just so sweltering humid that this window had expanded, could not be closed. It was the split second I said that, try calling upon the name of Jesus, that slammed down with tremendous force. I mean, really, really hard. It slammed down. And one of the girls, her head flew to the side. She'd been slapped on the left side of her head, which is, it is significant in demonic cases that things will tend to happen counterclockwise. Things will come from the left. So she was slapped on the left side of her head. She screamed and nearly fell off the bed holding her head. She said, somebody just slapped me. And you could see her head really go to one side. I mean, obviously I was frightened, but I was more angry, I think, than frightened that these children were being hurt like this. And I had been reading scripture all the way there. So I knew how to react. I just kept saying, don't be afraid. Call upon the name of Jesus. Jesus watches over the children. And as I said that, I said it 2 more times, and suddenly the activity stopped. And I could feel this current. Apparently, they were all feeling it too, because all of a sudden they looked up and they looked around the room and they said, it's gone. It's gone. And the room just felt normal. It felt natural. And they were so pleased that suddenly they didn't seem afraid right then. And that was a wonderful feeling. It all happened so fast, but and then we went downstairs, and of course they were doing a group hug and jumping on me, and it was just their mother was so surprised to see the girls this happy. They were all They no longer seemed afraid. Now, of course, it didn't leave the house, but it did leave that section of the house. It left that room.
Yeah.
And I didn't take that as that it was impressed with me at all. I mean, there was about the time I was like, because 5'7" and about 126 pounds, 127 pounds, and long hair. And I don't think it was impressed with me physically. It was obviously what I was representing, that I had said this in faith. And, of course, that is known as a religious provocation, which I wasn't really familiar with at the time, but I realized something could happen. Fortunately, it was contained. It was very contained. That situation was very contained, and no one was really harmed aside from the girl having their head slapped. But they was just so pleased and happy at that this had happened. And they saw, kind of like, the big brothers there, and the bully had to leave the room for a while.
Right.
Yeah.
So after this event, Keith joined the other members of the team downstairs.
But we came downstairs. We compared notes. Everybody was feeling something. In fact, some of our members became rather quarrelsome and argumentative. Sometimes this atmosphere will have an effect on people. Investigators will start quarreling with each other. So something was very, very wrong in that house, and there was no denying it. My brother had experienced it. I had experienced it.
And also that night, Andrea came to me, and we were the closest in age. She's about 15, and I was 18. And she came up to me, and she wasn't really like she was portrayed in the movie. It was a lovely young actress that played her in the movie, but Andrea was more very, very bookish kind of. And she came to me and said very, very coherently, Keith, not that I'm a chicken, but I have to go downstairs to get some preserves. I have to go down to the cellar. Would you mind coming with me? And I said, not at all, not at all. And I came down there with her, and she was getting some jars and say, I need this. But she was really hurrying. You could see her hands were visibly shaking. They were visibly shaking. And I told her, I said, God is protecting us. Don't have to be afraid. And I said, Jesus is with us. And she said, yes, he is. And she felt a lot better. And we came up together, and we made the trip safely. Now that basement, that cellar was very, very spooky, especially at the time. I think there was maybe one light bulb working there at the time. And the cellar was also known for spirit activity. The door could not stay latched at a certain time of the early evening. It would open up by itself every night. So finally, they just didn't bother securing it anymore.
Yeah, I remember one of the scariest parts that I remember that stands out in the book was one of the daughters saw like a reflection or something in the door.
Yes.
That just creeped me out. It takes a lot to creep me out in a book because I read a lot of books, but that really creeped me out.
Yes, she did see a reflection down there, and there was one time, sometime later, Andrea had some friends over, and I'm not sure exactly what happened, but they went down to the cellar, and it started to heat up or something, and the atmosphere became very reddish. Something was glowing, or it became very reddish, and they went back upstairs in a hurry. So.
And before leaving, Andrea and I shared a hug, and I told her and her mother, we're going to do everything we can to help you. And the rest of our group agreed that this was actually, we had experienced this. We knew they weren't making it up. This is the real deal. Whatever is in this house, there is some negative force, and we swore we were going to try to help them all we could. And you could see the relief on this family's their faces, just that somebody believed them, was not ridiculing them, and offered to help them. And you have to understand, this family, they were being ridiculed by family members. They were being taunted at school because they lived in the old haunted house. Even the church, when they asked for help, had turned its back on them because, church officials are human, and not all of them are prepared to deal with a situation such as this when confronted with it. So they finally had an avenue of help.
So the team decides they want to commit to helping the family. Keith says Carolyn at one point wanted to know if he thought she was crazy. It's a question that I've been asked several times from clients or listeners who have contacted me, or when I've investigated claims of hauntings in the past.
She asked, of course, when she told us this, she asked, "Do you think I'm crazy?" And of course, I said, "Absolutely not. We're here to help you. We'll do all that we can to see that you get help because you're obviously uncomfortable with what's going on." Now, not all the activity was negative, but every once in a while, Carolyn was experiencing things that were very, very unwholesome. So we decided that we were going to proceed with our investigation, no matter how uncomfortable we felt within the house, to do everything in our power to help them. And that's how we became involved with the Perron case, which, of course, years later became known as the Conjuring case.
So I think initially I thought you did have a connection with the Warrens. Did you have a connection with the Warrens at the time?
Yes, we did have a rather close connection with Ed and Lorraine Warren. My brother and I had attended a lecture given by Ed and Lorraine Warren the previous year and became very, very good friends with them. Met them during their lecture. That's when we were approached by members of PIRO. The chairperson was Donna. Her name was Donna. She invited us to come and be speakers at some of their meetings, and that's how we were eventually invited to join PIRO. My brother Carl and I became members when we were still teenagers, and that's when we joined our first investigation group, our first official investigating group. And, of course, we were close with the Warrens, and because this situation was getting very, very hair-raising, I had suggested maybe we should consult with the Warrens. These people are really, really in danger, seemingly in danger from at least one hostile spirit.
To better understand this danger that the family was in, we need to know about and understand several of the threatening experiences that Carolyn, the one doing most of the protecting in the family, but also the one most targeted, was experiencing. One of the stories is no doubt the most eventful, the most popular, and it takes us to the point where the Warrens take over.
Well, Carolyn had a number of experiences, and they were more puzzling at first, but she started to get the idea that this, whatever this was, had it out for her. And as time went on, Roger began feeling that the spirit kind of liked him and didn't like his wife. That's the impression they both got. But Carolyn had some very puzzling experiences, but they became, at first they were very annoying, and then they became more terrifying. One of her first outright experiences was she was in the barn, and she started feeling the presence, that some presence was manifesting. I guess it was similar to what I felt when I was in the house. And she was in the barn, and I believe it was a scythe came down from the ceiling. It was hung up near the ceiling, and it came down, spiraling down, and just missed her. So she just didn't feel welcome in the barn, so she stayed out of there. She would get out of the barn, stay out of there. Then it was a while later, she had come out of the bathroom. She was taking a bath, and they had an adjoining room that they called the warm room that was usually pretty warm. She came in there, was drying herself off. All of a sudden, a hanger leapt off a rack and began rapping her on the head. And she put her arms up defensively, and it clattered to the floor lifelessly. But some unseen thing had picked that up and began rapping her on the head. There was another time where she was cutting an orange. She was watching TV, I guess, with the family. She was cutting an orange, and all of a sudden, blood started spurting from it. Naturally, she thought she'd cut herself, but she looked, and she had not cut herself, and the rest of the family became very, very concerned. What's going on? Did you hurt yourself, Mom? And it would turn out it had come from the orange, and the blood started seeping out down to her toes and everything. And I guess she became woozy. She she went into a daze, and they had to snap her out of it. So these things were going on, and that's why when she finally came to us, interesting, my first meeting with Carolyn, she was a very, very attractive woman, part Native American. She had the high cheekbones and everything, the long dark hair. very almost exotic looking, a very, very attractive woman, but a little too thin. Now, as time went on, Carolyn started losing weight dramatically, and I noticed some dark circles under her eyes. Obviously, she hadn't been sleeping right, and she spoke very calmly and very coherently, but her fingers were shaking. They were trembling, and I think she was trying to hide that, but I could see that her fingers were visibly trembling. It was shortly after, it was less than a week after our first visit, and the night I had called upon Jesus, and Carl had seen the spectral figure, the dark cloud moving along the hallway near the bathroom upstairs. It was less than a week later. In fact, we were supposed to come there the next Saturday, but of course we told her, please, Carolyn, call us if anything happens in the meantime. Well, a few days later, we did receive a call, and Donna, our chairperson, took the call, and Donna Eisenstadt, and Carolyn was very, very upset. So Donna told her, please calm down and just tell me what happened. Well, it was that very morning that before she called her, it was early in the wee hours of the morning, probably about 5:15 a.m. And it was just getting light out. Carolyn woke before her husband, and she just had that feeling that something was very, very wrong. Something was very, very wrong. And there was a terrible stench in the room, which she described like a mixture of sulfur and decaying flesh. The smell of death seemed to be in her room. It was a terrible rotting smell. She heard a hissing sound. She looked over at her bureau, and something was going off. There was like a sparkling that she couldn't account for. Something was sparkling on her bureau, and then that stopped. That lasted only a few seconds. That stopped, and all of a sudden she looks over, and there was this, it's hard to describe what she saw, but it was some kind of phantasm or apparition. It was the figure of a woman, and the woman was dressed in a gray dress, an old gray dress with an apron on, and kind of the way she was described, not the time that Bathsheba lived, but maybe before then, maybe some decades before then, like an old-fashioned gray dress. She could see some dim facial features, but she couldn't, and the room was fairly dark. It was just about the morning twilight. And she describes the hands that didn't have any figures. They were just like broken bones, almost like twigs. They didn't have any real fingers. And this woman's head was very, very indistinct, cloudy features. The head was hanging to one side, as if the neck had been broken, and lolling to one side. And the figure started saying some kind of chant, sounded like a witch's chant. It was in verse, and she didn't remember all of it. So Donna said, well, I'm going to write this down, Carolyn. Can you please tell me what she was saying? And as far as Carolyn distinctly remembered, that the woman or the spirit, whatever it was, said, I'll drive you mad with fiery brooms. I'll drive you mad with death and gloom. I'll drive you out, but 'twill be too late. You'll be dead. And that's what Carolyn distinctly remembered at the time. And what she really couldn't make out the face, but it was the indistinct features. You could see that it was smiling horrendously on this head that was distorted, the neck to the side, and then vanished. Came over to her, looked down at her, floated over to her, and then just vanished. Meanwhile, Carolyn had been pushing her husband. She'd been pushing her husband. Roger, wake up, for God's sake. And Roger just seemed to be in some kind of somnambulistic sleep or whatever. He was not. He was dead to the world. He was not waking up. When he did wake up, she told him about it, very upset. He turned over, and he had gouges on his back. He had gouges on his back that were unaccounted for. And that's the only time that Roger seemed to have been attacked or felt any kind of injury from the spirit. Otherwise, it pretty much left her alone, even seemed to prefer his company, kind of liked him. But Carolyn was very, very upset. And of course, Donna did her best to calm her down and told her, we're going to contact our friends, Ed and Lorraine Warren. They have years of experience, and we're going to ask them what they think we should do. So as soon as I get off the phone with you, Carolyn, I'm going to call Ed and Lorraine Warren, and then I'll get back to you. And Carolyn very much appreciated it. She said, I'm sorry to bother you. And Donna said, no bother at all. And of course, Carolyn said, we wouldn't have any help at all if it weren't for you and your group. And so thank you so much for all you've done. So Donna did call. As soon as she got off the phone with Carolyn, she did call the Warrens, and she talked to Lorraine. And of course, Lorraine told Ed. And they were instantly extremely interested in this case we're on. And Donna said, well, what would you advise now? What would you advise us to do? They said, well, we'll actually come down there and we'll assist you. We'll personally assist you in this. And of course, Donna was thrilled, and the rest of us were, we're going to have Ed and Lorraine Warren working with us now. This is really good. We felt a lot better at it that we have somebody that has this experience. Our friends Ed and Lorraine Warren were actually going to come down from Monroe, Connecticut, and actually assist us in this. And Carl had actually asked Ed, so this is going to be a combined, my brother Carl, my twin brother, asked Ed, so this is going to be a combined investigation between you and PIRO, correct? And Ed said, oh, yes, absolutely, absolutely. You did the right thing by calling us, and we'll be glad to help you out in this. Very, very glad. And the rest is, Lorraine came in, said there is a spirit here, it's Bathsheba, this family's in danger, and they had a private conference with Roger and Carolyn, and that's when they said that PIRO has to leave. So
you weren't involved at all in the big heightened part of Andrea's story where they had, I think they called an exorcism in the lower level, and the daughters watched it. You weren't involved in that, were you?
No, I wasn't involved in that at all. In fact, the Warrens had we were all surprised, and the Perron family too. We were told essentially what Ed Warren said to them was, we've got to take over this case. If you want our help, it's got to be by our rules. And they told the family, first of all, it's not safe to be here at night. You have to sleep out on the porch. And of course, it was still very warm out at the time, relatively warm. You have to sleep out on the porch. Say it was a covered over porch. So, and secondly, PIRO cannot be involved any longer. We have to be the only ones.
Interesting.
Right. Ed said essentially they're good people. They mean well. They're the ones that brought us in, but they're a bunch of college-age kids, and this is much too dangerous. You need the pros, which is us. Otherwise, we just won't be able to help you folks.
Wow. Sign this contract.
Right. Pretty much so. Yeah, and the kids were, I heard the children were very, very upset about this, especially about me, because I was their favorite. I was the one that...
Yeah, you got mentioned in the book.
Yes, they did take quite a liking to me. They thought of me as... kind of a very, very protective force, a very protective personality. And also I was appealing at the time for the 70s. I was slim with long hair, very, very slim with very long hair. And, I looked like part of the in crowd anyway for the time.
You were hip.
Right, exactly.
Well, and for someone experiencing this kind of thing, in a small area where people aren't talking about this on a regular basis. And I'm assuming you went in kind of with the passion about these things. And so that would be cool to be able to latch on to someone who's interested in listening to them.
Oh, yes. Yes. And they were saying, when's Keith coming back? We want Keith back. But of course, that after the Warrens said that, as sad as they were to hear it, that ended PIRO's involvement with the case. And I know what happened afterwards. I wasn't there for it. So it wasn't until years afterwards that I got the full details of exactly what did happen after we left. And I know Ed and Lorraine Warren did come back in October. Meanwhile, the Perron family, of course, they had to move back into their house. They couldn't sleep on the porch any longer. And, it's interesting, as you probably recall, that the former owner of the house who sold the farmhouse to the Perron family, he had told Roger Perron, do your family a favor, leave the lights on all night.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. And Norma kind of denies that now. And even his family member, of course, he's passed by now. Even his family members said he would never have said that. But no, it's not just us knowing that. That's what we were told at the time. And I know people personally. I have some good friends In fact, a very good friend of mine at church, she grew up in that area. She was one of the neighbors. She said that they used to leave and she hadn't read the book or anything like that. But she told me, that guy used to leave the lights on all night, and the whole neighborhood knew that. They thought that was very odd that the gentleman, when he lived alone there, he just lived in a certain part of the house. And he used to live people knew that for many, many years, that people growing up in the area said, that's the guy who leaves his lights on his house all night. So that confirmed it. There were eyewitnesses, people who grew up in that area know that the gentleman kept the lights on all night, which made me wonder what happens when there was a power outage. Must have been a kind of a scary situation to live in. But
or when the light bill got high.
Yes, exactly. Oh, and the Perron family, Roger was practically pulling his hair out. In fact, he's lucky he has a full head of hair now. It's the electric bills, the heating bills. It was always, and a lot of it he couldn't account for. There was some energy drain in that house, and they were never able to trace it to anybody stealing their power. But it's like the incredible amount of power that was going out of that house that he had to pay for. That was driving him crazy. And after we left, we were close friends with the Warrens, and they came over to, that same year, they came over and had dinner with our family and everything. And, we asked them, how's the Perron family doing? And they said, oh, they're doing fine. Everything's under control. Everything's very, very well under control. Well, it wasn't until years later, the situation was not quite as in control as they led us to believe. In fact, it was a near catastrophe after we left.
Kind of some foreshadowing of the competitive paranormal investigation stuff that we have going on nowadays.
Yes. Oh, yeah. That's hitting the nail on the head. Yes, that was a foreshadowing of the competitiveness, and it actually is. Very. Most paranormal groups, it's fun. People like to go out investigating, but when you get really into the heart of it, it's very cutthroat. It can be very, very competitive, and I've tried to stay out of that as much as I can. But you always have controversy. Every once in a while, it'll come back. You can't get along with everybody. So, but that was a foreshadowing of it.
By now, I had already learned the less than factual information going on about Bathsheba. So when I asked Keith if he thought the makers of The Conjuring were aware of this information, he took the opportunity to clear some things up on her behalf. So I'm curious, when the production company is putting together the story for this movie, and, it's supposedly based on the Warrens' case files, yes. Do you think they knew that a lot of this stuff was a little inaccurate, or there were myths involved? Or do you think it was just no one bothered to really correct it and research it? You have any thoughts on that?
I don't, my personal opinion is I don't think they really cared that much, because it was a good story. And when Lorraine came in, she said there was an evil presence, a very hostile presence in that house. And she said, and her name is Bathsheba. So that solidified it right there. I think to them, no more proof or research was necessary. Lorraine, she believed it was Bathsheba. That's the impression she supposedly got. And she discerned that. And so I think that was it. That was pretty much nailed it on the head. And, and of course, people just took it for granted that the Bathsheba story was true.
Yeah. And I'm assuming at that time, the Bathsheba story probably hadn't really taken hold as much as it is now. And it was probably more of just a concern of, we need to help this family and kind of console them and figure out what's going on. Am I correct?
Yes, that is correct. There was some supposition about Bathsheba Sherman because Carolyn had heard some rumors in the town. She talked to somebody that was, he worked, I guess he was a store clerk in a local general store. And he was an older man, and his name was Mr. McKeechan, and he actually knew Bathsheba Sherman. And he said, well, what a cantankerous woman she was. She was a tyrant. She used to beat her servants and everything like that. But when you look upon it, he would have been about 4 or 5 years old at the time, would have been about 5 years old at the time of Bathsheba being around. And so anything he knew about this was not from personal witnessing it. It would have been from, yes, he probably saw Bathsheba around town, but he would have heard these rumors from other people too. So there were no real eyewitnesses around that knew much about Bathsheba. And the historic record shows that she was a parishioner of a local Baptist church. She had been married in a Baptist church. She had married Judge Judson Sherman. She was a pretty well-to-do farm lady. They were pretty well off. They had a very, very successful farm business, so successful that they could hire some farmhands, and the farmhands would live with them from time to time, maybe 1 or 2 at a time, I would imagine. But the town records show nothing at all that there was anything unusual about her. And I mean, she may have been a severe woman. We don't know, but even her death seemed natural. And there was the rumor that she hanged herself. There was also a rumor that her body was solidifying, turning to stone. Well, what her obituary and her death certificate say was paralysis. And it was a sudden paralysis, which means obviously most probably it was a stroke. Since it was sudden paralysis, then she died shortly thereafter. So the records actually show nothing unusual about Mrs. Bathsheba Sherman at all. We know that she's buried with her family. She did have a son that outlived her. She's buried in the local cemetery nearby. Now, the Perron family did take us. The Perron girls did show us the cemetery. We took a little trip down to the cemetery, which is right very, very close to their house. And they showed us Bathsheba's grave, but they didn't know a lot of facts about her. How Lorraine came up with the name Bathsheba is a mystery, because as soon as she set foot in the Perron household, she did say, there is an evil presence here. Its name is Bathsheba. Now, I don't recall. I don't know if any of us had mentioned Bathsheba to Lorraine at all. I've collaborated with some other people that were there at the time, and nobody remembers if they mentioned Bathsheba to Lorraine or not. So, I mean, that's kind of like a 50-50. I can't say definitely we had, but supposedly she walked in and discerned that the spirit of Bathsheba was there and that she was terrorizing the family, especially Carolyn, the mother there.
Right. I mean, and what year was that when she died?
Bathsheba died in 1885.
Yeah. So that was a long time ago.
Yes, a very, very long time ago. And of course, Mrs. Arnold died before her. Mrs. Arnold died in 1866. But she died in age 72 in 1885. And I haven't been able to find anything from the time that is at all unusual about her. I do know that it was a Baptist preacher who gave her eulogy, and her funeral was well attended, which kind of tells me she must have been respected within the community. Mm-hmm. She's buried respectfully. She's buried next to her husband. She was actually married a second time. She had outlived her first husband, Judson, and her name when she died was actually Bathsheba Green. However, I think she was very, very briefly married to him, probably several years. Her long-term husband was Judson, and she's not buried next to Mr. Green. She's buried next to her husband, Judson, with her family. So, Christian burial, and there's nothing unusual about her burial place or anything. Her stone was broken and mended, but I mean, that's quite common for historical cemeteries. And so the Bathsheba controversy didn't really seem to take a real foothold until Lorraine declared that this is Bathsheba here. And Bathsheba is the one that's tormenting Carolyn, and Bathsheba is the evil spirit. So that's how that connotation really became solidified. And of course, the movie sealed Bathsheba's reputation pretty much for all time.
Right.
You mentioned Carolyn's first experience with what she assumes is Bathsheba, and that's one of the main scenes in the film, kind of one of the climaxes of the film. In general, what are your thoughts on Andrea's books and how it compares with the film, and how your experiences, I guess, compare to the film? What's your take on all of that?
Well, the film was, I must give it credit. It was a very, very entertaining film, very, very well done, and it certainly wasn't a bloody movie or a gory movie, but it had that Hitchcock kind of suspense to it. A lot of jumps and thrills, very, very good movie. You could relate to the characters in it because most of them were actual characters that we knew personally. But as far as the true story goes, the true story would not translate well into a 2-hour movie. And this drama, so to speak, went on. The spirit phenomena went on for almost a decade that this family experienced it. So that would be very, very hard to condense into a 2-hour movie. Andrea's books tell more of the full story from the family's perspective, from Andrea's memory, and of course she pooled her experiences with her siblings and her parents. So more of the actual true story is Andrea's books, which are very lengthy, and her trilogy tells much more of the complete story than any film adaptation could possibly do.
Yeah, and Andrea has a very poetic style of writing, and very descriptive. Like you can't miss. If she's telling the story, you're going to picture it all because she doesn't leave anything out. So after the overwhelming success of the movie, the current owner of the farmhouse, her name is Norma, and I only mention her name because she ended up commenting on one of my blog posts. She began claiming that their property had been consistently invaded, vandalized, and trespassed upon by inconsiderate and crazy fans of the movie and the story. And I first learned about this when Andrea herself posted a video pleading for people to stop violating the privacy of Norma and her husband. And this was back in late July, the same month the movie came out. Well, almost a year later, as I said, Norma commented on my blog. And I should be very clear that I have no way of verifying that this is the Norma, but she left links to a kind of YouTube tirade, a video that is over an hour long. And in the video, which as of today can still be found on YouTube, she maintained that they've experienced no paranormal activity in the nearly 3 decades of them living in the home after the Perrons, which is strange because this conflicts with her interviews and statements in the 2005 Ghost Hunters episode where Taps investigated at the farmhouse. Well, her comment on my blog post, she says people are still coming. And again, this is 2014. So this is like almost a year later after the movie. She says people are still coming. I have a YouTube video disproving claims and speaking about the devastation we face because of the movie, The Conjuring. The Perron story, the current owner speaks out. That's the name of her video she put together. Also found on History versus Hollywood, several months of research with a journalist to find her mother created the myths about murder, suicide, etc. Listening to many interviews found other false statements. Our discovery of facts may help in questioning the entire story. I have more information. Well, after watching the video, the very lengthy video, she was upset that, The Conjuring included personal and private information, including the name of the actual town and the Perron family name. The movie, she claims, is complete fiction and not based on reality. Andrea Perron was more involved in the movie than she claims. That's what she says. She says Carolyn Perron made up much of the haunted history of the home, including details of the infamous Bathsheba. She claims that there were statements made that the production company had been providing security for Norma and her husband and was somehow assisting with all the chaos. And Norma denies that any of this was true. Now, you've spent time fairly recently at the farmhouse with Norma, and some time has passed since all of this drama. But can you put any of the pieces together or clear anything up for me? Because it's always kind of confused me, and I get lost in it all.
Mm-hmm. My personal opinion, and this is based upon years of experience and also interviews with people involved, and plus evidence that we have found. My personal opinion is there are still spirits in that house, but they're, compared to what the Perron family went through, they are very, very inactive. Very, very inactive. I believe they are still there. I've had evidence that they're still there, but they're very, very inactive, especially compared to what they were. Now, Norma and her husband are very, very wonderful people. Apparently, Norma had very little idea how much was going to turn her life around. Similar situation to the Amityville house in Long Island, where anybody who lives there, their peace is disrupted. So,
right.
This movie came out, and Norma's world was turned really, literally upside down. Now, it's not that Norma, then this is based on speaking with her personally and what I experienced there. Norma and her husband have experienced activity there over the years, very, very minor. And I say over the years because it was very sporadic. It certainly wasn't constant like it was with the Perron family. Very minor activity that has happened there. Certainly nothing terrifying that would make them run out of the house. There's been some knocking, some vibrations, a shaft of light, which is something that Carolyn experienced. A shaft of light came down the chimney, blue light, and immediately went back up the chimney very, very rapidly. But that's about it for what Norma has experienced there, and her husband. It's just vibrations in a chair, and that's a door opening and closing, but that is not really a lot of activity to experience over the amount of years they've been there. And what they have experienced is nothing compared to the harassment they received when even the trailer for the movie came out. Suddenly, at 2 or 3 in the morning, they have people walking through their yard to peek in their windows to see what they think is going to be a continuation of the movie they've just seen. They're going to come into the Conjuring house, and they're going to see Bathsheba running through, people levitating, and that's of course, that's what people think. Legend trippers, they're thrill seekers, and they really have done a number on Norma's peace and quiet. Norma is not experiencing any activity at all at this time. I can't say that she's never experienced activity, and I can't say that I've never experienced activity since the Perron family lived there. I was able to capture some EVP, electronic voice phenomena, with a tape recorder going. Some voices were picked up. This is not that unusual a phenomena. There's other houses and residences that, of course, we do pick up EVP on in the course of our investigation.
Mm-hmm.
Electronic voice phenomena, some samples were captured at that house after the Perron family moved out. But I must say, I would not call that really haunted house now. It's not like upsetting activity is happening. It's not that people are being poked and prodded or frightened. Certainly there is nothing visual seen there now. No activity, virtually no activity right now. So the fact is that Norma and her husband, their lives were turned upside down by the release of this movie through no fault of their own. It's just that they were, unfortunately, victims of circumstance, where this house has a reputation for being another Amityville horror. It is not. Despite what the Perron family experienced when they lived there, that's not the situation in this house now. And the house itself looks nothing like the house that was portrayed in the movie. In fact, the house in the movie, The Conjuring, is actually more based on Lorraine Warren's house in Monroe, Connecticut.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting that they use the Warren's house to model after the, in The Conjuring. But the house itself in Harrisville looks nothing like that. It's a very, very beautiful house, an 18th century farmhouse, but very, very peaceful. you do not get that feeling at all from being there now. Of course, they discourage trespassing. Obviously, these people are senior citizens, and they want nothing but their peace and quiet. And obviously, they're wishing that the movie had never been made because it did disrupt their lives terribly in their senior years as well.
Well, I think, Andrea, in the third part of the trilogy, I noticed she tried to kind of lay out some of those legends and explain that, a lot of those weren't based on fact. And she kind of, I think, went into some more research about that. And, anytime you have a house that has centuries of history, so it's a complicated story.
Yes.
But, I do wish them peace there, because I can't imagine. I feel, I remember even when I was first hearing about it, when Andrea posted her initial video about a lot of the, crazy stuff going on there, I felt so bad. And then here I was, kind of, not that I am at all like considered media, but here I was, blogging and contributing to, the hype of it. And then all that stuff was going on. So I felt kind of bad. So you already mentioned EVP a little bit. The listeners of my podcast tend to be, as well as me, tend to be very fascinated by spirit communication topics in general. And I was just curious if there were any tools or toys in the paranormal that you were just a big fan of. Do you have a favorite?
My favorite is actually a simple recording device. I often use it's an analog recorder. I have a couple of them. Actually, I have a few of them. One is, we refer to it as Old Faithful because I've been using it since the early 1980s.
Wow.
And still, somehow it survives and continues to function after a fashion. But I've captured a number of EVP on that. Some people prefer to use digital, which is very good, and it's very, very sensitive, so you have to be very, very careful what you're recording and to eliminate excess noise because it does pick up from quite a distance. But we still use the magnetic analog tape recorders to pick up sounds. We recommend an external mic. That way you eliminate gear noise. For example, there's a allegedly haunted cemetery in Exeter, Rhode Island. Somebody left in the late 1970s, somebody left a tape recorder going on one of the graves, and they picked up what sounded like a heartbeat, and they were thrilled about this. They'd actually picked up a heartbeat on this grave. Well, it was professionally analyzed, and it turned out because there was no external mic connected, it was just the sprockets of the cassette turning around, boom, 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 and it's magnified. Of course, it sounded like a heartbeat, so that ruled that out. But
I think a lot of us have those experiences where you learn lessons as you go along.
Oh, yes, exactly. And because a lot of people it's referred to as the ghost box, which is simply it's like a scanner. It's a radio that's been modified to act as a scanner, and the theory is that if the spirit wants to communicate through that device, it will pick a station or a word here and there and communicate through that. I have to say, most of the results of that are dubious. It's trying to matrixing, if you will. You're matrixing it. You hear something that sounds like something. It can be hello and maybe get help out of that. It's very, very rare that you get something exact, but of course, you have to be very, very careful that you're not reading something into it. Now, EVP, of course, that's electronic voice phenomena. That is when you don't hear it at the time, but when you play back the recording, you do hear a voice. And the best kind to capture is what we call Class A EVP. We do have a number of Class A, and Class A EVP, you don't even have to guess what it's saying. It's as plain as myself or yourself talking. It's a spirit voice or alleged spirit voice, something disembodied that imprints its voice onto the tape. Now, if you hear it and record it, that's great. That's more like audible voice phenomena. where you actually hear a voice and it's captured on the recording as well. Extremely rare for that to happen, but we've had it happen once in a while. Occasionally we've had that happen. Fortunate enough to capture that. We have a number of EVP that my wife Sandra and I have collected. New England Anomalies Research, of course, is what we run. We have a number of very, very clear examples of EVP. I wish every example was like that, but of course, many examples are not. You have to try to figure out what it says. And if you have to really try to figure out what it says, then it becomes a class B or C or D EVP, as we refer to it. But the clearest ones, which are very rare, but you do get them, are the class A EVPs. And that's what we demonstrate when we give lectures locally and throughout the country.
Yeah, EVP is my favorite area of paranormal investigation. And I love, when you start putting pieces together through EVP. I wish it happened more often because, a lot of times it's just hours and hours of debunking and debunking and debunking. And I tend to be very skeptical about it at the same time. So sometimes I'm like, is it really worth it? All these days that I just sat here listening to these recordings?
Well, that's a good point. Of course, they show you the high points on the TV shows. They don't realize how tedious and boring it can be just sitting down and waiting hour after hour for something to happen. You're recording it. Then after that is going home and listening to these recordings and watching hours and hours of video where usually nothing happens. And we have to take shifts of listening and analyzing the evidence. In case somebody falls asleep, somebody else can take over listening to it so we don't miss anything that might be there. That's mostly what it is like. You get a case like the Perron household, that does happen, but it's very rare. Most of the time, it's just listening and recording and then trying to analyze your evidence, which is worth it when you do come across with something.
So there you have it. To date, it is by far the biggest editing challenge I've had in putting together an episode of the podcast. And guess what? I've got more of my conversation with Keith that I'm going to save for a future episode. In that episode, I'll share some of the more general information about the topic of demonology, which is a topic I don't approach much, so I know you'll find that interesting when that comes out. We'll also talk about some of his paranormal TV appearances, upcoming projects, the books that he has written, Ghosts Are Near, which is a show he does with his wife Sandra. I've got several episodes of that on YouTube. And I know you'll be excited to hear exactly what kind of nerd Keith Johnson is outside of the world of the paranormal. So, I'm not sure if it'll be the next episode, but it'll be coming up soon. You can find more on Keith, his wife Sandra, and their research by visiting nearparanormal.com. That's NEAR paranormal.com. NEAR stands for New England Anomalies Research and Investigations. Keith and Sandra are the founders of NEAR. You can also find them on Facebook if you search for Keith and Sandra Johnson.
You're listening to the Big Séance Podcast with Patrick Keller. Look for us on iTunes and be sure to check out BigSeance.com for more discussion.
International Podcast Day is September 30th, and you can help spread the word. International Podcast Day is dedicated to promoting podcasting worldwide. You may be asking, what can I do to get involved? It's pretty simple. First, head over to internationalpodcastday.com and check the suggestions. Second, use hashtag Podcast Day to join in the conversation. Remember September 30th. Now, let's start the conversation.
I hope you're having an amazing week. The weather clicked over to fall around here, for sure, and hopefully it's here for good. And so my favorite season is here. Stay tuned for some more spooky goodness as we approach Halloween. Bye, guys.
For show notes, including links to anything we may have mentioned in this episode, visit BigSéance.com, now the home of both the blog and the podcast. Just click on the Big Séance Podcast logo or find it in the menu. You can also find and subscribe to the show on iTunes and Stitcher. Do you have any comments or feedback? Please contact me at patrick@bigseance.com. You can call my feedback line at 7755-TELL-ME. That's 775-583-5563. You can also record audio feedback right from the site using the SpeakPipe link included in the show notes. I could decide to include your voice in a future show. Thank you so much for listening and reading. Unfortunately, it's time to blow the candles out, but we'll see you and light them again next time.